Chips is a scary story about a man who sells his soul to the devil and gets plagued by a talking rat. There was once a shipwright and his name was Chips. His father's name before him was Chips, and his father's name before him was Chips, and his father before him, and his father before him. So he came from a long line of Chipses. Chips the father had sold his soul to the devil for an iron pot, a bushel of 10-penny nails, a half-ton of copper and a rat that could speak, and Chips the grandfather had sold himself to the devil for the same, and Chips the great-grandfather had done the same thing, and all of them came to a terrible end, but the bargain had run in the family for a long, long time. One day, young Chips was at work on a ship at the docks. He was all alone, down in the dark hold of a ship that had been hauled up for repairs. All of a sudden, he heard a voice saying, "A lemon has pips, a yard has ships, and I shall have chips." Chips looked up and there, lurking in the shadows, he saw the devil. He had eyes as big as saucers and they burned with a red glow, spitting out sparks of fire whenever he blinked. Hanging over one of his arms by the handle was an iron pot, and under that arm was a bushel of 10-penny nails, and under his other arm was a half-ton of copper, and sitting on one of his shoulders was a rat that could speak. So, the devil said again, "A lemon has pips, a yard has ships, and I shall have chips." Chips was so frightened, he didn't say a word. He just went on with his work and tried to pretend it was just his imagination. "Chips ahoy," said the rat that could speak. "Chips, old boy. What are you doing?" "I'm putting in new planks, because you and your kind have eaten the old ones away," said Chips. "But we'll eat these timbers too," said the rat. "We'll let in the water and drown the crew, and then we'll eat them too." "I'd like to see you try," replied Chips as he carried on with his work. He did his best to ignore the devil, but he couldn't keep his eyes off the half-ton of copper or the bushel of 10-penny nails, because nails and copper are like gold to a shipwright, and shipwrights will do anything they can to get them. "I see what you're looking at, Chips," said the devil. "You'd better strike the bargain with me. You know the terms. Your father before you was well acquainted with them, and so were your grandfather and your great-grandfather before him." "I like the copper," said Chips. "And I like the nails, and I don't mind the pot, but I don't like the rat." "You can't have the rest without him," said the devil, fiercely. "He's part of the deal." Chips was afraid of losing the half-ton of copper and the bushel of nails, so he said, "Hold on a minute." He took a pencil and a piece of paper and scrawled out a deal with the devil to sell his soul. He handed over the signed contract and in return, got the half-ton of copper, the bushel of nails, the pot and the rat that could speak. With a cunning smile, the devil vanished. Chips used the copper and the nails to finish repairing the ship, and the deal made him very prosperous. He tried to sell the pot, but nobody wanted it. Now that he was a wealthy man, Chips wanted to find himself a wife, but no girl would come near him. The rat was perched on his shoulder day and night, and as soon as any girl saw it, she would run a mile away. So, Chips decided to kill the rat. One day, when he was at work in the shipyard, he put the rat into the iron pot. Then, he heated up a big kettle of scalding hot pitch and poured it into the pot, filling it full to the brim. He kept his eye on it until it cooled and hardened. Then he let it stand for 20 days, and then he sank the pot in water for 20 days more, and then he got the smelters to put it in the furnace for another 20 days. When they took it out, the pot was glowing red hot, but the rat was sitting in it, looking just the same as ever. It laughed and said with a jeer, "A lemon has pips, a yard has ships, and I shall have chips." With that, it jumped out of the pot and scampered away. Chips hoped that he had gotten rid of the rat for good. After that, he met a lot of women, and every night, he went out on a date. When he found one who was more beautiful than all the others, he asked for her hand in marriage, and she, of course, accepted. But a terrible thing happened next day. When he put his hand in his pocket, he found a rat. In his hat, he found another, and in his other pocket, another, and in the sleeves of his coat, when he pulled it on to go meet his fiancée for dinner, he found 2 more. From that time on, he found himself plagued by rats. They climbed up his legs when he was at work and sat on his tools when he tried to use them. They got into his house, and into his bed, and into his teapot, and into his beer, and into his boots. When he bought a box of chocolates for his fiancée, a big fat rat jumped out of it and scratched her face. When he put his arms round her and tried to comfort her, he found a bunch of rats clinging to her back. So, the marriage was called off and everything was cancelled. The rats even ate the wedding invitations. You can imagine what a terrible effect all of this had on poor Chips. His life was in ruins and he fell into a dark pit of depression. He kept yelling and screaming at the rats to leave him alone. His boss in the shipyard thought he was mad and fired him, and he couldn't find another job. Soon, Chips was penniless and the rats were still crawling all over him, day and night. Eventually, Chips couldn't take it anymore. He was driven to the depths of despair by the rats and was desperate to escape from them. One night, he went down to the shipyard on the docks where he had made his deal with the devil. He stood at the edge of the docks and stared down at the water. He intended to put an end to it all and drown himself. But, when he jumped off the docks and landed with a splash in the water below, Chips looked back and realized that the rats weren't able to follow him. They were all gathered at the edge of the docks, staring at him intently. Rejoicing at his good luck, Chips swam as fast as he could and managed to grab onto a rope that was trailing behind a ship that had just set sail. When the sailors pulled him on board, dripping wet, he realized it was the very same ship he had repaired in the shipyard. He signed up to become a member of the crew. When the admiral learned that Chips had been a shipwright, he set him to work immediately doing any repairs that were necessary. The ship was bound for the West Indies, and as they sailed and sailed across oceans green and blue, Chips fell in love with the freedom of the sea. With the cool breeze in his hair and surrounded by the salty stench of seaweed and fish, he finally felt at peace. The ship was called the Argonaut, and on the bow of the ship there was a large carved wooden figurehead. One day, the sailors noticed a small hole in its forehead, and so Chips was lowered down on a rope to repair it. Dangling on the end of the rope, he found the hole, but he couldn't figure out what had caused it. Peering into the hole, he was shocked to see millions of red eyes and sharp, white teeth, and he could hear the sound of nibbling and gnawing. Suddenly, a large rat poked its head out and said, "Chips ahoy!" "Chips, old boy!" Chips recoiled in horror. It was the rat that could speak. "We're eating these timbers through," said the rat. "We'll let in the water and drown the crew, and then we'll eat them too." Chips was filled with terror and dread. He climbed back up the rope and tried to tell the other sailors what he had seen, but nobody would believe him. They all thought he had gone crazy. Chips demanded to speak to the admiral. When he entered the admiral's quarters, Chips gave a big salute and said, "Sir, I must speak to you about a matter of the utmost urgency." "What is it?" asked the admiral. "We are sailing on a doomed ship, sir," said Chips. "If we don't put to shore immediately, we are all going to die." The admiral looked him up and down. "Young man, your words are a madman's words," he said. "Sir, the ship is infested with rats," said Chips. "They are nibbling us away. There is dust and hollowness where solid oak ought to be. Those dreadful rats are turning us into a floating coffin. The life of every man on board is at stake." "My poor fellow, you are clearly insane," said the admiral, shaking his head. Then, he turned to the guards and barked, "Take this man below deck and lock him in irons." So, Chips was dragged down to the hold of the ship and the guards shackled his wrists and ankles and left him there. He lay in his cell for 6 whole days and nights. By day, he would scream over and over, "We're all going to die," but nobody paid any attention to him. By night, he would lie awake and listen to the rats nibbling and gnawing in the walls. Around midnight on the 7th night, a small hole appeared in the hull of the ship and water began to leak in. Within minutes, there were holes all over the ship and they kept getting bigger and bigger. A torrent of water rushed in and nothing could stop it. The ship went down with every living soul on board. A few days later, the remains of Chips floated to shore. The corpse had been partially devoured and, sitting on his chest, was an enormous, overgrown rat that just kept laughing and laughing. A lemon has pips, a yard has ships, and I've got chips. Amina is a scary story about a man named Sidi Newman. He marries an Arab girl named Amina whose face he has never seen, and, after the wedding, he discovers, to his horror, that his wife is a ghoul. There was a young man named Sidi Newman who came from a wealthy Muslim family. He was about to get married, but he had never met his bride. According to the customs of the time, the marriage had been arranged by his parents. In fact, he had never even seen his bride's face. The custom was that a woman would keep her face hidden behind a veil until after the wedding. All he knew about her was that her name was Amina. When the wedding was over and Sidi went home with his new bride in his arms, he was quivering with anticipation. In the privacy of their bedroom, Amina removed her veil. Sidi was surprised and relieved to find that she was dazzlingly beautiful. Filled with joy, he took her in his arms and hugged her tightly. And so the honeymoon began. However, the day after the wedding, Sidi Newman and his new wife were sitting at the dining room table. The servants had laid the table with a variety of delicious foods. However, while Sidi was gobbling his dinner down, he noticed that his wife wasn't eating a thing. As he watched, she pulled a small metallic case from her pocket and said it opened it. She took out a long pin and used it to daintily pick up her rice, grain by grain. After only eating a few grains of rice, Amina put the pin back in its case and excused herself from the table. Over the next few days, whenever they ate together, Sidi noticed that his wife barely ate at all. Sometimes, she would swallow a few crumbs of bread and then sit back, claiming she was full. Her strange behavior worried him to no end. One night, when Amina thought he was fast asleep, she slithered softly out of bed. Sidi was only pretending to be asleep, and when he heard his wife rising from their bed, he became suspicious. Keeping his eyes firmly shut, he listened as she dressed quietly and crept softly out of the room. The moment she turned her back, he got up, put on his dressing gown and followed her. Glancing out the window, he saw her leave the house and walk down the street. He ran down to the front door and followed her by the eerie light of the moon, to a nearby graveyard. It was the middle of the night and the cemetery was deserted. Sidi concealed himself in the shadows and peered over the graveyard wall. To his surprise, Amina made her way to the center of the cemetery where she was greeted a strange man who was sitting on a crumbling tombstone. Sidi was too far away to hear what they were saying. Together, Amina and the man dug up a fresh grave and uncovered the coffin. Sidi watched in horror as they dragged out the decomposing body, cut it into several pieces and ate it, slavering and slobbering over their sickening feast. Watching from his hiding place, Sidi shuddered at the disgusting sight of his wife devouring the rancid flesh of a corpse. When they had finished their graveside feast, Amina and the strange man casually tossed the moldering bones back into the grave and filled it in with earth. Sickened beyond belief, Sidi fled from the cemetery. He ran back home and jumped into bed, pretending to be asleep when his wife eventually returned. Amina undressed and slipped quietly back into bed, unaware that her wretched secret had been discovered. Sidi Newman couldn't sleep a wink all night and, in the morning, he left the house before Amina woke up. He went to town to consult a fortune teller and seek her advice about what he should do. He told her about his marriage to Amina, her curious eating habits, and the horrible sight he witnessed in the graveyard. "Your wife is a ghoul," said the fortune teller. "One of those foul demons that wander about the countryside, making their lairs in deserted buildings and springing out upon unwary travelers to eat their flesh. If they cannot find live prey, they will go to the cemeteries and feed upon the dead bodies. What can I do?" Sidi begged with tears in his eyes. "Please tell me." The fortune teller handed him a small bottle, filled with a murky liquid. "Take this and go home immediately," she said. "When the time is right, throw this potion in her eyes and then you shall see what you shall see." When Sidi returned to the house, it was time for dinner and his wife was there to greet him. They sat at the dining table and waited as the servants placed dishes of food in front of them. As usual, Amina produced her little metal case, took out the pin and began picking up grains of rice, one by one, and placing them in her mouth. "What's the matter, Amina?" said Sidi quietly. "Is there something wrong with the food?" "No, I'm just not that hungry," she replied. "Perhaps there is something else you would prefer to eat," said Sidi with a sly smile. After all, nothing tastes sweeter than the rotting flesh of a corpse. No sooner had he uttered those words than Amina flew into a violent rage. Her face became purple, her eyes looked like they were going to pop out of her head, and she was gnashing her teeth in anger. She leaped across the table and furiously tried to grab Sidi, but he was too quick for her. He opened the bottle and threw the potion in her eyes. Immediately, the lovely Amina turned black in the face, her skin began to smoke and the flesh shriveled from her bones. Sidi watched in terror as his beautiful wife's face started melting. She fell to her knees and her body disintegrated before his very eyes. When it was over, all that was left was a puddle of thick, dark sludge where Amina had once been. The Phantom Hitchhiker. Joel Harris was tired, so tired that he shouldn't have been driving at all. It was nearly 3 a.m., and he had been up since 6 o'clock the previous morning. "Too hard," he muttered to himself. "I'm pushing myself too hard." To make matters worse, it had begun to rain. Joel had to strain his eyes to keep the deserted road in front of him in view. Thank God, it's only 30 more miles. It was the sort of situation in which an ordinary driver might have been tempted to speed a bit, thinking that by getting home faster he could beat the rain and the fatigue. But Joel Harris was one of those instinctively cautious drivers. He automatically slowed his speed to adjust to the deteriorating driving conditions. A sense of real danger cut through the weariness and made him more alert. That's why Joel became aware of the figure at the side of the road before most people would have. First, it was just a flash of white in his headlights, but as the car drew closer, he could see it was a girl. She was young, about 18 he guessed, and she was wearing a white party dress. She wasn't actually thumbing a ride, she was just standing there. As the car came closer, Joel made eye contact with her. She looked at him pleadingly. A young girl, alone at night on a deserted road, wearing only a flimsy dress, with the rain beginning to really come down. There was no way he was just going to pass her by. Joel stopped and leaned out the window. "Hey, you need a lift?" She was already walking toward the car. "Sure do, mister." "Thanks. You're lucky it's me. You can stand on this road for hours at this time of night without seeing a car. And then you never can tell who is going to stop. You hear about all sorts of terrible things that can happen." The girl didn't say anything. She just climbed into the back seat of the car. "Where you going?" Joel asked. "Middletown." "This is your lucky day, that's where I'm going too." "Where in Middletown do you live?" "I'll take the ride home." "No sense in your wandering around town in the dark." She gave him an address, which Joel recognized as being in one of the older and poorer sections of town. He didn't know that part of town well, but he figured he could find it easily enough. Joel switched on the interior light and turned to get a look at his passenger. Perhaps he had overestimated her age. She might have been only 16, it was hard to tell. She was quite pretty, but looked worn and tired. Her hair, wet from the rain, hung down to her shoulders. Her dress was also wet and rumpled, and had a curiously old-fashioned look. Probably second-hand, he thought. Joel had wanted to ask the girl what she was doing on the road at 3 in the morning, but there was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel he shouldn't ask that question. It was really none of his business anyway. If she wants to tell me, she'll tell me, he thought. The girl shivered slightly. "You must be cold. I'll turn the heater up, and here, take my jacket." The girl thanked him, wrapped the jacket around her shoulders, and lay back in the seat, her eyes closed. She seemed to fall asleep almost instantly. Poor kid, thought Joel. She must be exhausted. I wonder what happened. Joel drove on in silence. He didn't even turn the radio on for fear of waking his sleeping passenger. It didn't take long to reach town, and he found the address the girl had given him without much trouble. It was the worst house on a bad street. In fact, the house was so dilapidated that it looked deserted, and Joel wondered if he had somehow gotten the address wrong. "Is this the place?" There was no answer, so he repeated the question more loudly. Still no answer. "Sound sleeper," he thought. He turned around. The back seat was empty. Joel's first reaction was surprise, but that was quickly replaced by fear. He hadn't stopped the ear since he had first picked up the girl. He checked both back doors, and they were locked from the inside. There was no possible way for anyone to have gotten out of the car. Yet the girl in the white dress was gone. Joel just wanted to drive away and forget the whole thing. But he couldn't. He had to try and find out what had happened. He went up to the accident on that road 10 years ago. She was coming home from a party. You're not the first young man to have had this experience. It usually happens on rainy nights. She was killed on a rainy night like this one. She seems to be trying to get home. Laura's buried in Oaklawn Cemetery just outside of town. Joel had expected to be called crazy, but he never expected to hear a story even crazier than the one he told. He didn't know what to say. He just mumbled something about being terribly sorry and walked away. Before he did, he caught a glimpse of the name on the door of the house. It was Kearns. By the time Joel got back into his car and drove away, he had begun to convince himself that the whole experience had never taken place, that it was all a hallucination brought on by extreme fatigue. Things like that happen, he thought. That must be it. He shivered in the cold. Only then did Joel realize that he didn't have his jacket on. He stopped the car and searched for his jacket. It wasn't there. He had given it to the girl in the white dress, and she had taken it away with her. Now Joel could not let the matter rest. The following day he went out to Oaklawn Cemetery. With the help of the caretaker, he was able to locate the Kearns family plot. Sure enough, there was the grave of Laura Kearns. She had been just 16 when she died, 10 years earlier. Draped over the tombstone, neatly folded, was Joel's jacket. Boy with matches. This is a scary story about boy and student camp counselors. At Camp Strongbow there was a regular initiation rite for new boys. The counselors would take each one out in the woods alone and tell him that he had to pass a survival test. The test was to see if the camper could survive on his own in the woods for a week. The counselors would then hand the terrified camper a hunting knife and 3 matches and tell him that they would be back in a week to pick him up. Of course, it was a joke. The new campers had to spend only one night in the woods. When the counselors came to get them the next morning, most boys were so happy to be rescued that they couldn't get mad at the joke that had been played on them. A couple of years ago, the counselors at Camp Strongbow took a new camper out into the woods and told him the story of having to survive for a week alone. This particular boy was from a big city and had never been in the woods before. Besides, he was very timid, so when the counselors left him with his knife and 3 matches, he was really scared. Early the next morning, the counselors went to pick the boy up, but they couldn't find him. It seems he had been able to build a fire. They found a small pile of charred wood and 2 spent matches, but the boy was nowhere around. The counselors searched all day, but couldn't find him. The next day, the state police were called in, and they brought bloodhounds. Still, no clue to the fate of the missing camper was ever discovered. The practice of initiating new campers by taking them off into the woods was stopped. In fact, Camp Strongbow was closed down and had to reopen under another name. But many people have seen a mysterious light in the woods around the camp during the summer. When the source of the light is discovered, people find the remains of a small campfire and 2 spent matches. But there is never a trace of the person who built the fire.